All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Welcome to this Identity Management Day 2022, and this is our final session, and I think it's going to be a really great one. We've got a great group of folks here for you to talk about what is the future of identity management, not only from a technical perspective, but we're going to be looking at, Paul Zolfaghari is going to be talking about the markets and what's the landscape of vendors, and there's a lot of news out there on vendor movements and different activities from a market standpoint. So I think it's going to be a really good discussion. And so I want to just start with some introductions and just have go around the room here, the virtual room, and have everybody introduce themselves, starting with David Mahdi. Welcome, sir.
Excellent, Paul. Thanks for having me. And I guess just by way of introduction, Chief Strategy Officer, CISO Advisor at Sectigo. I recently joined Sectigo coming from Gartner, where I worked with you, Paul,
Yes.
covering identity and access management, decentralized identity, bring your own identity, and a raft of topics that clients would just throw at us. So today, really looking at still things like decentralized identity, machine identity, which I know we will be talking about today. And yeah, so thanks for having me.
Great. Welcome, David. Yeah, it's good to finally talk to you again. You had a great time with you, Gartner, and yeah, I agree that not only I'm sure you covered hundreds of other topics as things came up with clients. So looking forward to getting your perspective on things today. So
Excellent.
next will be Paul Zolfaghari. How you doing, Paul?
Good, thank you, and glad to join. So yeah, Paul Zolfaghari, I'm a managing director at Carrick Capital Partners. Carrick is a growth equity, private equity firm that invests most generally in enterprise software companies, and I specifically have focused on the infrastructure, identity, and cybersecurity space. So I'm looking forward to the session and providing a little perspective on how investors are looking at identity both today and in the future.
Great, thanks, Paul. So Kristina Yasuda, she's from Microsoft. So welcome, Kristina. How about a little background on yourself, and welcome to the talk.
Thanks, Paul. Yes, Kristina Yasuda from Microsoft. I am their identity standards architect, mainly focusing on user-centric identity, which includes verifiable credentials, aka decentralized identity, mobile driving license, which I'm sure you guys are interested in. So we'll elaborate later, but we're looking forward to providing perspective from standards, ecosystem use cases, from conversations with different players.
Great, thank you, Kristina. Yeah, that's going to be an exciting conversation. And last but not least, Andrew Hughes. How are you, sir? Welcome.
Doing good, Paul. Out here on the west coast of British Columbia in Canada. I'm Director of Identity Standards for Ping Identity. Working alongside folks like Kristina, helping to build out the standards landscape at the ISO level, at W3C, OpenID Foundation, FIDO, name your standards body. There's work to be done on decentralized identity. So I'll be talking a bit about what's the point of decentralized identity, and from that basis, what should we be looking for in the future? What are the possibilities? Glad to be here.
Excellent. Just quick on myself. So Paul Mezzera, I work at Saviynt, Vice President of Strategy, and I've been in the identity space for a couple of decades now, mostly as a security and solutions architect, faced with the challenge of actually implementing solutions in these large organizations, but also had the privilege of working with David and others at Gartner, covering IAM, and now at Saviynt. So trying to lead the strategy for where the company is going and what things are important. So I'm definitely going to be taking notes from this talk for my day job. So really nice that everyone's here. And so I guess what we'll start with is the machine identity. So I was thinking myself, machine identities, they've been around for a while. It's not a new concept particularly. I mean, we've Gartner's kind of given the moniker machine identity, but we're familiar with things like service accounts and identities that really aren't owned by a human, and that they do things, right? Like either run a service or make an API call, et cetera. But I think in this day and age with the advent of the cloud, machine identity, I think, is so much more critical to securing our enterprises. And I think, it's a real important topic. So David, so I wanted to ask you really what is machine identity from your point of view, and what do organizations, our listeners, really need to understand about it, and what can they take away from this,
Yeah.
this concept?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. No, absolutely. I think, I was at Gartner just over 6 years, and it was a term we were able to get it into Gartner's top security trends going back a couple of years ago. Actually, no, sorry, it was 2021. Sorry, the COVID time dilation always messes with me.
Yeah, definitely.
It was last year. It was last year. It was raised as a strategic area that security and identity professionals should be looking at. So there's identity first security, but then there's also machine identities. And really, it was Eric Wallstrom, who's an analyst, current analyst at Gartner. When we looked at the space, we realized that we needed to have a proper definition, right? And it's going beyond, as you said, those service accounts to many other things. And when we first started having these conversations, it was, I want to say 2016, 2017. And during that time, if many of you folks here on the panel and the audience remember, there was a big hype around IoT, right? IoT was going to take over the world at that time. So when Eric Wallstrom and I would talk about machine identity, there was a lot of confusion between, service accounts, human identity, and then also IoT, right? So we had to do a lot of clarification as to what we mean, because it does still also mean IoT. But before we do that, I just wanted to, the reason why, we're flashing this slide here is to kind of show that, look, Gartner and other sources are saying that the IAM market is about 25 billion by 2025. I actually saw one that came out, it was like 26 billion-ish by 2027. It's something in that vicinity. And, good growth rates, but that's primarily focused on what you see on the left-hand side, things like access management or like single sign-on, that kind of stuff, privilege account management, or even cloud versions of that, cloud infrastructure entitlements management, IGA, and user authentication, of course, user authentication, right? So being kind of a little more aligned to humans. So that 25 billion, for the most part, has pretty much been focused on humans and human use cases. I think we're a selfish bunch, aren't we? Anyway, if you can go to the next slide, please. So, I think before we really dive into this and open it up to the rest of the panel, I think I always like to start with definitions so that we're on the same page, right? So what I spent a lot of time with, along with Eric Wallstrom and others at Gartner, was defining what this is. And there were a lot of arguments, right? Intellectual ones, but what are machine identities? Well, there's devices, IoT, as I mentioned, mobile devices, laptops, desktops. There's also software and applications. So those can be machines as well. In fact, when you go to a website, your browser authenticates the certificate of the website to know what is the identity. Can I trust this site, and can I establish a TLS session with this site so I can maybe securely share credit card information or other stuff, right? So that is also a form of authentication where a website is authenticating to your browser and your device. There's also the highly rapidly growing area of robotic process automation, where think of it like bots, right? So organizations taking mundane tasks and building these bots to act either as a digital twin, say for you, Paul, or to be a totally unsupervised bot that could be, say, event triggered, right? A chat bot or something. Well, guess what? These bots need rights and entitlements. These bots need access to resources. Wait a minute, doesn't that sound like IAM? So we need to start doing that. And we do see, some privileged access management vendors, some in the IGA space doing this, but that's really, I think where we should start it. But yeah.
That makes sense. I mean, I think of RPA as almost really mimicking a human, right? Doing something, right? So do you think that, say other, so RPA, you might even want to manage it in many ways like humans. You want to make sure they don't have overprivilege and et cetera. You understand what they're doing. But for these other devices, what do you think? Is there a different way that we have to manage those machine identities than, say, an RPA bot or a user?
Yeah. I mean, so I had this amazing engagement with a client a couple of years ago, and it was a very high secure environment, and they were investing heavily in RPA, but they had very strict kind of certificate-based identity, using smart cards for some scenarios. They're dealing with a lot of classified information. So what they did, which was kind of interesting, was number one, Paul, they defined the different kinds of bots that were there. So what do I mean by that? There were what they called supervised bots. So supervised bot, think of it like you create a digital twin, and that bot is sharing your rights and entitlements. And in essence, it's another version of Paul. But then there's completely unsupervised, where you use a framework like Blue Prism or UiPath, you make your bot, and then it's purely event triggered. So they needed to define those first, to say if they're borrowing from a human, then we need kind of like a derived credential. If it's a completely new entity, it needs its own identity. And for many of them, they were looking at certificate based, because they didn't want just a static username and password, of course. And they couldn't give these bots tokens or, hey, use a biometric to get in. Well, the bot doesn't have any, biology or, retina or face for it to use. So it has to use other methods. So they selected certificates to be that case. But the last piece I'll just say really quick was what I really liked with what this client did was they actually had a risk profile. So if they knew that whether it was supervised or unsupervised, if the machine was accessing unclassified public information, it's like, whatever, it could be secrets based, a static secret. But if it was accessing very secure classified information, then it had to be, certificate based, and it had to, be backed by an HSM and all this crazy hardware behind it. But, there is a spectrum, and there are nuances, I would say, for each one of these. But overall, I think the point, Paul, that we noticed was that, there needs to be attention to this. And it does parlay into all the other areas of decentralized identity, user-centric identity, because the point is that as humans, these devices and software, they are the way how we interact with the digital world. You don't just walk into the web or the metaverse without a device. You need a device. So we have to understand what those machines are in between us, even today, as we're doing this, having this conversation.
No, that's great. And I think I always look at it as kind of a couple of different ways from an identity perspective is, what are the credentials that these machine identities need, and maybe how do you manage those, the life cycle of certificates, for example. But then also just answering that question, I think, is from a IGA standpoint, who has access to what, right? So who all has access to these what machines have access to call other machines or other resources. And just from if I were a CISO or someone in security, I wanted to have that visibility, right, of what exactly is going on in my environment. So with these machine identities, I think it's probably even more difficult to see that. So I think tools that help us with that, I think, is going to be real key for organizations to get get a good handle on the visibility and management of machine identities. You agree?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, from the perspective that I have now and what I've lived through thus far, there are many organizations where their machines already outnumber the humans that are in their environment, and many organizations are investing in that last bullet to help automate and streamline many operations. And in fact, COVID kind of short-circuited many of those initiatives, right? So if you look at even Gartner and other analyst firms, their projections for RPA, we're talking like tens of billions of dollars in market value that will be created there. So, I think it's a really important area that CISOs, IT leaders, security leaders, identity leaders, they need to start thinking about this, because it really is about the harmony of humans and machines. So, and I know as we dissect the other topics, Paul, there's definitely, some deep connections as well. So.
A good point.
Yeah, David, maybe you could elaborate a bit more on how much of existing IAM tools can be used for machine identity right away versus how much new has to be invented / reinvented / adapted?
Yeah, I think Kristina, that's a great question. Common question I still get today, especially from a lot of practitioners and even investors as well, and saying, David, what is the machine identity management market? You know, or even before when I was an analyst, is there a magic quadrant for it? Right? That's always the question that Paul and I would go crazy over. There's a plethora of tools, right? So even if you look at this slide, I mean, there's IoT platforms that you need to use. There's mobile device management that you need to use. There's other fleet management and endpoint security tools, right? So right now, it's think of it as a messy Venn diagram where there's a lot of overlap. And I would say that there's no really singular tool today. The only tools that are really out there that kind of cover this are more in the PKI space, doing kind of certificate management, connecting these use cases. But I think it's fertile ground for the market to start to expand. I think, again, I wanted to show the number of the human side of things and how there's been a lot of investment there. But I think now as time goes on, and with the US federal government recognizing that trust needs to be built into all the devices and systems, well, how do we do that? And with a lot of it is with the cryptography that could be built into these systems so we can identify them and we know what they are. And I think, Kristina, I know given your intro you gave, right, you're focused on things like user-centric identity, decentralized identity. Well, if we're using devices like this to access services, can I even trust this? Can you even trust that if I use this and it's me using the device, but how do you know that the device itself, the software, the crypto modules can all be trusted along the way? And I think that's a big part of what this is. So there's no singular solution today for any of this stuff at the moment. It's still kind of emerging.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. Yeah, and I was thinking about what you said about the mobile device, right? And I think that's a great segue into our next discussion, really about decentralized identity and kind of mobile identity and mobile credentials. And I know Andrew's very excited and passionate about this topic. So, Andrew, so yeah, with that in mind, yeah, tell us about what you're seeing in terms of digital identity or decentralized identity standards and mobile identities and such. And I know you're really excited about what's to come. So, yeah, please enlighten us.
Sure. Thanks, Paul. So everyone watching, please send in questions and chat and comments. We want to interact with you. And panelists, please stop me if I say something controversial, because I like saying stuff that's controversial. So I thought I'd sort of frame up a context for the discussion about decentralized, because it's very hard to tell what decentralized identity actually is. Everyone's got their own definition. Everyone's got their own sense of the emerging market, the emerging technologies, and it's hard to see the thread. So whenever I encounter a topic like this that's confusing all over the place, I try to get it back down to the basics. And the basics of decentralized identity and identity management in general, it's all about identity information and credentials. It's just that the identity information is transferable in a different way with new standards, new protocols, and digital credentials are available in different technologies and old technologies, and they allow different patterns to evolve. So I'm just going to leave this slide up here so that the audience can read as we go through. That first bullet, really, it's all about organizations needing information that they can rely on or trust to do things like identify a customer or an entity needing something, authenticate that entity to increase the confidence that it is actually the correctly identified entity, or decision making. Well, any decision the organization or person has to make is based on information. This is a systems approach. It's a records management, records first kind of view on the world. Okay. So how do organizations get information that they can trust? Well, think of the analog to your existing physical wallet and the cards, credentials, and certifications that you collect up to date. People collect cards, credentials, certificates from issuers of many kinds, of every kind, governments, private industry, clubs, associations, professional associations, that sort of thing. They collect them up into one or several places, and then they present them onwards. And the receiving organization can examine the cards and certificates and say, yeah, I believe this is not tampered with. I believe that the issuer that it says on the card is actually the issuer, and that the information on the card or credential is an authentic representation of information held at some registry of the issuer, right? That's the key. The credential itself, the plastic, is the reason you can trust it as an individual today is it has security features. It's embossed, it's printed, it's glossy, that sort of holograms, that sort of stuff. And you can believe to the level of your risk tolerance whether or not it actually represents information held by the issuer, right? Untampered. The difference between old style identity and identification with cards is that in decentralized identity, we're bringing the person back into play, right? Old style identity is back office, system to system transfer of information. Decentralized identity puts the person in possession and in control of the credentials issued and then presented onwards. You'll hear wallets, digital credentials, presentations of credentials. You'll see in Kristina's slides about the standards, we have issuers, holders, and verifiers, but always there's the holder in the middle, the person in the middle, exercising their control, choice, and consent to share the information. Okay. Now, what's made this possible? Well, mobile devices make this possible now, because finally, mobile devices can keep secrets. So keep your private keys private. And because people can now hold cryptographic keys without losing them or forgetting them, because they have the device, you can use cryptographic techniques for data integrity and proof of provenance, right? So my opinion is that the advancements in mobile devices and the security features and protections, information protections they have, is one of the key enablers of the decentralized identity world. There are new standards taking into account the person and the fact that information is intended to move through the person to the verifier. Kristina will get into that in more depth in the next section. There's also this increasing awareness that if information is supposed to flow, that people are at risk. If too much information flows, that's not under the control. Most of the time, a verifier or relying party doesn't need the actual piece of information. They just need proof that the information was recorded somewhere. And this is where we get into the technologies around zero-knowledge proofs and non-correlating information sharing. So proof that I know something without actually telling you the fact that I know, like the piece of information I know.
Yeah, I think that's a key piece too, because in today's world, right, we think about everything that about us is on, these huge mega platforms, personal information, and they're just perfect places of concentrated data for hackers to enjoy stealing, right, in large numbers, right? We have data breaches of millions of records. We're just so used to it. Probably most of our identity information is somewhere out there already for most of the world. Mm-hmm. So I think this is pretty promising in that now what you're saying is, if I understand this, the information, really, we don't need to share some of that personal information, but instead we could assert, say, for example, if we need to prove if we're in the healthcare field, we need to prove some certification that we're a licensed medical practitioner, and we don't need to get into the details of when I graduated or anything like that, but I could just have someone verify, okay, this person is a certified medical professional, right? And without sharing that information.
And that comes into play when you can prove the provenance of the information, right? So if you can prove cryptographically end to end that the fact that you are a medical practitioner was certified and evaluated by the medical board in your state, then you don't have the verifier doesn't have to go back to paper and pick up the phone and phone the registrar and say, I have this person, fax me the picture of them. Wait a minute, I don't have a fax machine, and so on. Yeah.
I was going to say, no, I think that that's such a big piece, because there's a whole market of identity proofing, right? Where they will go and verify you. And obviously in the past, there's a lot of knowledge-based KBA, knowledge-based authentication, right? And many times we would forget those questions. But the thing that always bothers me, and Andrew, Kristina, I think what I'd like to hear, Kristina used the term, I said a few times, like user-centric identity. And I'm sure from a lot of the audience, they probably heard about self-sovereign identity. And, it's kind of interesting when you think about, like, I'm Canadian, so I live in the capital of Canada on the other side, Andrew. But I look at my Canadian passport and you flip through it and you're like, this is property of the Canadian government, right? So even though it's my credential, I don't actually own that document. So how do we kind of deal with the notion of self-sovereign identity, decentralized identity, and user-centric? Like, what's your view on that?
So it's a very interesting point that the bearer of the information, the credential, the passport, the driver's license, is owned by the issuer. It's one of the ways they can retain information integrity and provenance integrity, is because that it came from them, because it has all the features and electronic tests that are involved. What is self is the fact that you get to choose which credentials you present, in many cases, and what combinations of information you present or not present. So in a government scenario where you need the official government issued photo ID, you don't have a lot of choice. You got to show it to get the stuff. Otherwise, you don't get the stuff. But in less formal, less, you shall do this, otherwise nothing happens cases, think of person-to-person marketplaces. A driver for Uber, a delivery person for food. You don't really need government issued photo ID. You just need to know they're the authorized person. Right? And that's where the personal autonomy can come into play. The other person has government issued photo ID because you can see the proof and test it cryptographically. That they own the car because the car asserts, being a machine identity, that the person is authorized to drive it. Their license and insurance is all good. So layering all this together with your expectations as a person, you can accept the forms of it and identification presented without having to deal with who owns the actual medium of transport.
Yeah.
And Kristina, I think you want to jump in on this one too.
No, I was just want to dispel one myth. I think majority of the use cases referred to as self-sovereign identity has nothing to do with self-issued identity or self-declared identity. Like, yes, there are use cases when, I'm filling in a form and maybe it's okay that it's, me claiming my certain claims. But majority, if you look at all the use cases Andrew's just given, they are issued by some trusted party. And that's at the core, right? So I think ensured self-sovereign identity is a misnomer. So if you can, translate that within your mind into the term that fits the most with you, whether it's user-centric or decentralized identity or whatnot. But majority are not about self-issued claims. That's just,
And for the audience that's been reading this slide repeatedly and absorbing it deeply.
Well, you left it up there, Andrew, so you can
play. I this is my worldview. I've been working on this one for a while. It's about how much do you believe the other party is actually the counterparty, the issuer or the receiver, and how much do you believe it? How much do you trust it? And the indicators you can get with verifiable credentials and decentralized identity are being built in ways that are the same or better than the physical cards and paper-based identification that we see today. One last thing, just before I stay on the slide, there's a very, very strong willingness now for official authorities to start issuing digital credentials alongside or in place of plastic credentials. We are seeing legislation and regulation change, and that is the key indicator that the authorities, right, with the highly valuable, highly private information, are willing to have these new instruments exist. And as soon as that happens, innovation can happen on top of it. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kristina.
Cool. Yeah. So Kristina, yeah, standards. I think for all of this to work, we got to have standards, right? So we can't be having this, this mobile phone with this protocol and this issuer with another standard. So I think the standards is really helping to create this ecosystem, right, where we can have interaction between different products, solutions, vendors. So I'm really interested in, as far as, you're representing yourself, but I know you work for Microsoft. So I think Microsoft being involved in this, I think, is pretty critical given their presence in the market and from identity standpoint, right? So maybe you could start with just some basic terminology here around decentralized identity and what are some standards? I think standards like.
Sure, yeah. One context of, so standards have been really important in identity space overall, as I think we all know, but they are particularly important in this decentralized space where the process of issuance is being decoupled from the process of verification, which means if you want any application, any wallet to store your credential and as many entities to become issuers and pretty much everyone be able to verify, that means much more standardization efforts than usual, pretty much, because that means, all the three entities need to understand the same protocol, same algorithms, same security protections and whatnot, depending on the use case, obviously. And yes, another myth I wanted to dispel today was don't automatically connect decentralized identity with blockchain. Like this whole thing can be realized without blockchain. Like no one here is talking about writing users' identity data on blockchain. Okay, no one. I mean, maybe some, but at least not like in this context. So essentially, yeah, what the biggest point is, this is a huge shift in a trust model and huge shift in a key management, essentially. That's the nutshell. Where currently, think of yourself as a service provider. You're trying to identify, authenticate someone who came to you digitally and to check if that person qualifies to a certain service. Right now, that person has no means to prove to you who they are. So what you do is you redirect that user to a big identity provider whom you trust, with whom you have pre-established trust relationship, and you trust that identity provider has said, this user is actually Kristina, you can trust her, right? That's kind of, don't kill me for oversimplifying, but that's like one sentence summary. So what we're trying to do here is instead, the issuer whose now signature, the verifier as a service provider trusts, if user can bring to you a certain digital credential signed by that party you signed, you don't need to talk to that issuer or identity provider directly anymore. You just need to talk to the user in front of you who's bringing to you that credential. And if the checks, the policy you set up, meets your expectations, whatnot, you can authenticate and identify the user and give whatever services the user is asking for. So that unlocks certain use cases. For example, now user in one transaction can bring to you several credentials issued by multiple issuers. So right now that would mean 3 different redirects to 3 different identity providers, for example. But now you don't have to do that anymore. It also solves certain correlation problems that I know some of the industry have been concerned with. And initial POCs, we have some really quite amazing numbers. I think David mentioned identity proofing as a use case, and indeed, employee onboarding, workplace credential, those has been emerging first use cases. And for example, let me pull the numbers. We shortened, so not we actually, one of the providers in the space succeeded to shorten time to provide required credentials for the user, right? So usual process, imagine I have to upload a PDF, for example, I have to find it, have to go get it. So that got shortened on average from 48 hours to 30 minutes, and time spent on validating those identity and credentials were reduced from 3 days to 30 minutes. So that's quite powerful. And again, this is not to say that this fits any use case and gonna suddenly solve all our problems, but in certain use cases, it definitely has a lot of cost and time benefits. And just to close on, because I think we're running out of time. So in the bot, so I was mainly just talking about this flow in the middle to show, the decoupling of three entities and presentation and issuance. But one important question arising in this industry, in this sub-industry, is how, when, let's assume I convinced you it's a great use case, great implementation. But then when you actually start implementing, you face a lot of choices of actually how to implement. So standards, you see a lot of different standards, and everyone will try to convince you, it's the great solution. So I think and this is kind of personal opinion, but what we need to do is be clear on the problem you're trying to solve and pick the standards that match your use case. And what's interesting is one of the kind of, that the standard that would greatly influence interoperability would actually be the protocol layer. How do you actually transport those credentials? And that's what we have been really focusing on. And my personal belief is OpenID Connect is really well suited to do that because it allows flexibility to choose your own credential data model, your entity identifiers. This is where blockchain might or might not come in, and then it gives you a lot of flexibility on revocation mechanisms and additional trust frameworks and whatnot. So try to choose, try to identify what would really impact interoperability and which aspects could become extensibility and enable more choices, I think would be 2 cents.
Great. Thank you, Kristina. Yeah, and I hope if we have time at the end, we'll have each person give us what's your recommendations and what to look for our audience out there, what they could actually take home and start planning for in their own environments. But I want to transition over to Paul talking about the market. I know this is not only just the identity market, but the cybersecurity market is undergoing a lot of transformation changes, and real interested in hearing your thoughts. I know David was mentioning the size of the market, identity market, and it's just exploded in terms of the market size. But other than that, Paul, I'm really interested in hearing about your perspectives on the market.
Well, thanks, and Paul, thanks for the opportunity to speak. Just kind of even bringing us back to what our session is about. Our session is about the future of identity, and I think in reality, the future of identity is going to be driven by companies, right? And companies' ability to invest, not just existing companies, but new companies. And at a high level, and it's my opinion, but I think it's reasonably well shared, there is a lot of enthusiasm and continued interest in the opportunity for identity management companies to continue to prevail, given the market opportunity. I would say that when you think about investments, it's rare, and I think identity satisfies really two secular or tailwinds, and it's rare really to have two happen simultaneously, especially when they're somewhat divergent. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So many of the speakers that have preceded me have talked about identity as being a precursor to cybersecurity, to risk and compliance, and for very good reason. And so if you think about that, that's a defensive use case. It's a use case by a company really to secure existing investments and existing assets, and arguably is a cost to the company. So not typically going to drive revenue when you think about it from a cybersecurity standpoint, but secure investments that you've already made. And that's a box that identity checks. But identity, and I think sometimes this isn't as well understood, also checks a very important box that is much more proactive and much more offensive, and that is digital transformation. In other words, if you look and think about identity, identity is the enabling force behind so many new products, so many new services, so many new revenue streams, improving the HR experience, improving the customer experience. And so it's actually rare to have a technology solution that is both a cost of sale, like, risk, compliance, security, but simultaneously be a foundational enabler of growth, right? Of growing your customer base, growing your service base, and growing your revenue base. And identity is really both. And so I think a lot of times the market thinks about it in this bucket of cybersecurity and security, and it most certainly is, but it is absolutely an enabling force for digital transformation. And any company that wants to be more digitally proficient, that wants to offer more products, more services, enter more areas. So in that sense, from an investor standpoint, it's a very ripe place to be thinking about because it's funded by two different pockets of investment, right? And that I think it's rare and important. I know I don't have a ton of time. I'll just touch on a few more points. One thing I would say is when you think about identity, there's this idea, and you've heard a lot about it, of convergence, technical convergence. Why is that? Well, because identity not that long ago was a new area. And when it's a new area, you have a lot of investment in what you'd think of as point solutions. Somebody sees a small part of the problem. They're a new company with somewhat limited resources, and they can solve that part of the problem. And they gain traction. And larger companies, the consumers of these solutions, wake up one day and realize they've got 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, point solutions, if you will, and start to ask themselves, well, can I find a way to consolidate that, right? Because very few buyers are asking themselves, can I find a way to do business with more vendors? Most of them are trying to say, can I do more with less? So what's happening in identity is the market has matured. It has become something that is so foundational to companies that they're now thinking about, how do I find the companies that can really be almost infrastructure or platforms for me going forward? Therefore, how big of a piece of the pie, can I give them? So that's driving a lot of consolidation because the companies need to consolidate in order to provide a more complete solution to the end customers. But it does create an interesting paradox. And the paradox is that when you have a combined stack solution, generally speaking, and it's very rare, all parts of that solution are not best of breed, right? It is usually a good enough solution, and cobbled together or bolted together can solve the vast majority of the needs in the marketplace. So the interesting paradox is a lot of the companies that are focused on one area and might be smaller end up being pushed higher up in the market, because higher up in the market are the companies with the more differentiated use cases that literally cannot rely on a combined stack solution from somebody else. So when you think about that as the maturation of the market, and as an investor, you say, okay, what am I looking for in those companies, right? That either can exist in standalone fashion or can become a viable market leader and maybe eventually combined with something else. Look, strategically, the companies that will survive, especially new companies, they have to do one of two things, and ideally they have to do both. That is, they have to demonstrate innovation and customer service. Smaller, innovative new companies, or startups, if you will, really can only be successful in those two areas. That is, they have something innovative they're bringing to the market that doesn't exist, and ideally they provide a better experience than a larger existing player in the market. Otherwise, the larger players simply dominate every other part of the equation, right? They have the partner channel, they have the marketing spend, they have the services spend, they have the familiarity. So when you think about companies and we think about investments, you want to look at ones that are very innovative, but also have a really good engagement model and provide a great experience for the customers. I also want to talk just briefly about what the market looks like today. Most of us probably, if you look back, you see companies that have gone public or have gained unicorn status, and then you look at the P&L and you're like, how's this possible? They're losing hundreds of millions of dollars a year. How is this even fundable? That's effectively coming to an end. And so that era, I think, is coming to an end. The financial markets are no longer going to continue to support substantially money-losing companies. You've seen it happen in the public markets. It's happening in the private markets as well. And it's going to be accelerated by the fact that as interest rates gain, there's less ability to raise and utilize debt, therefore less ability to fund money-losing operations. And so if you look at both the public and the private markets, one of the other foundational things that are going to back up successful startups is they're going to have to be more financially sound. And I'll just touch on 2 quick points about what that typically means. It means when they're making investments in R&D, the investments really are going to have to be tied to revenue, right? As opposed to just speculated attempts to go try something, poke around, see if there's something there. By and large, the R&D investments are going to have to be thoughtful in nature, tied to existing use cases, existing needs, and have a much closer return to payoff. Second is that as these companies are building and scaling their own businesses, they have to be much more thoughtful about their go-to-market strategy. When money is not an object, you just hire a bunch of salespeople, you spread them out all over the world, you bear all these costs, and you think, well, I'm going to have a payoff at the end. If you can't lose that much money, that model is not sustainable and durable. So you need to have innovation, you need to have great customer service, but you're now going to need to be really financially sound in both your technology investments and how you engage the market so that you can maintain, something close to profitability or durability. I know we don't have a ton of time. Let me end with a couple of points. When you think about what's going to happen with startups, right? If you're in a smaller company, you're either going to go public, you're going to remain private, maybe be combined with somebody in the private markets, or you're going to be acquired by a larger strategic player. The public markets are not nearly as sympathetic to technology companies as they have been. And so that's not necessarily the march that everybody is on anymore. If you look back at 2021, the vast majority of technology IPOs are actually trading down from their issuing price because, again, many of them were losing money. Many of them did not have sustainable business markets. And now you've got just macro concerns. So the march to become a public company, in my opinion, is going to be less deliberate. Less people are going to see that as a viable option, and it may take longer to enter the public markets. The private markets, and Paul intimated to this a minute ago, you may have seen it in the news. SailPoint is, for instance, the public news that Thoma Bravo, which is one of the large private equity buyout shops, has a multi-billion-dollar offer to take SailPoint private. I think you'll see more of that, and there's a reason for that. There's a lot of private money on the sidelines and a lot of private money that has to be deployed. The way private equity and venture capital firms work is their money has to be deployed in order for the firms to generate revenue. So if they've raised all these big funds, they have to find a way to make investments. And it touches on a point that my colleague on the board here, Kristina, asked about when we were doing a pre-session, which is why are there so many companies that seem to be getting funded when they don't have a clear product and maybe their business model isn't super obvious. And the simple fact is there's just more money than there are good companies, period. It's an economic issue. There's more money that has to be deployed than there are good ideas. So a lot of companies that probably shouldn't be funded are getting funded. And secondarily, the payoffs for technology companies that actually get this right is so high that you can almost fail 5, 6, 7 times with investments as long as you get one that hits it. It kind of pays out for the rest. So it's a somewhat artificial environment, but it is one of the reasons why you see a lot of companies getting funding and being valued at billions of dollars. And you look at the underlying business and you're like, I just don't see it. And that's because the payoff is so huge and the money has to be deployed. I'll slow down. I'll stop there because I think I'm right at the 150 mark. So
yeah, thank you, Paul. Yeah, I don't know. Do you have any thoughts around what's this do to the skill sets out there in the labor market in terms of how things are changing there?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's the first time in my experience, and I used to be in companies for a long time and have been an investor for about half a decade now, but it's the very first time that when we evaluate companies now, one of the things we evaluate is their ability to recruit, hire, and retain talent, because it is literally now viewed as almost important as managing their balance sheet, as the ability to do product management, product development, and their business model. Because if you cannot recruit, hire, and retain talent, there's no way you're hitting the forecast that you're showing to the investors. And the investors know that. So it's unbelievably important to get that nailed down. And the competition is so high that companies, I think, are struggling, with all due respect, in following through on their hiring needs. And I think investors are going to have to dig really deep looking at these companies to make sure that they can follow through, not just on the business model, but on billing to staff it from an HR perspective.
Yeah, and I think, Paul, I'll jump in really quick.
Sure.
I mean, and Paul Z, I like what you were saying, because when I worked for a startup years ago that did decentralized identity stuff, you come to the realization that the most important customers are the employees, right? Without good employees building good product, you don't have any end customers, right? So it's interesting to hear that shift has been had. But I think at least the perspective, Paul Mezzera, that I've had with his skill sets, having spent years running workshops with aspiring IAM professionals or IAM professionals looking to tune up their skills. I think along with that market change that Paul Z was talking about, we've certainly seen more of an interest in people getting involved in identity, right? And so what's interesting when I look at the makeup, some of those folks aren't coming from cybersecurity backgrounds. They're coming from HR, right? They're coming from HR because they spent a lot of time on joiners, movers, leavers. And so I certainly see a lot of interest there. So indeed, though, I think the skill sets in understanding the nomenclature, some of these standards that Kristina and Andrew were kind of alluding to, having some of those on your resume, I think will be very powerful, and at least letting organizations know, like, hey, I have an idea of what FIDO is. I have an idea of what access management is. I have an idea of cloud identity and how to deal with entitlements across hybrid multi-cloud. I think those are going to be important criteria for any security or identity professional out there.
No, thank you, David. And while you have the floor, let's wrap this up with some takeaways from each of the panelists. Maybe start with you, David. What could you recommend for our viewers out there to do in terms of machine identities, and anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, sure. I'll go super fast. So it was also the great question that Kristina had, products, right? So just be mindful. Today, there isn't a singular product that can do machine identity for you, but you all, the viewers, you all have machines that are in your environment, and some of them have really high privileges, and they can do a lot of damage if a bad actor takes them over, even things like printers. So, use things like discovery tools, certificate discovery tools, invest in identity-first security approaches. So there's lots of stuff out there on that. But if you do a quick Google search on machine identity management, you should be able to see some of the stuff, even some of the past articles that I wrote and what you can do there, because there's a variety of different products and services that you should employ. And a lot of them you might already have today, but it's a matter of just formulating a strategy and figuring out what you need to do.
Great, thanks, David. How about you, Andrew?
I've been thinking about this question for half an hour now. So in my opinion, the idea that decentralized credentials are coming is actually going to change everything. The information will be available to you as an organization and under your control as a person. And it will allow different kinds of services and innovation to happen. But there's two things that actually matter more. One is the input. So ID verification and proofing. Having a credential that has no proof behind it is pointless. And authorization. Once you have information that's trustworthy coming from the person, you have to make a decision. And that's where authorization engines and orchestration come into play. So credentials will change, digital credentials will change the world, but you'll see the businesses of identity verification and authorization engines and orchestration engines take off in the next 3 to 5 years.
Excellent. Thank you, Andrew. Kristina, any final words for us?
Yeah, I think in short, it's evolution, not revolution. And especially in decentralized space, you would hear strong statements like everything centralized is bad. it's not. We have billions of businesses in that space who are making, solving real problems. And as we're learning from machine identity too, it's evolution, right? So I think we should be really careful with these strong statements of this is not that SSI, right? For example, so when making choices, when researching, while having this ideal end state in mind, what tools can we use from what we have now to evolve into that final state is, I think, how we should be thinking about the future of identity.
Great. Thank you very much, Kristina. Paul, we'll end with you, sir. What can you help us take away with?
Well, thanks. I'd say that the people that are listening in are either users of identity solutions. They're probably vendors, meaning they have an identity solution, or they're a practitioner in the space. And I'd say if you're a user, the future is quite good. The market is going to continue to value investments in identity. I think those investment dollars are now going to pass through, I think, a more thoughtful system of building companies that are more durable in time. And so I think if you are a user and a company that is deploying identity solutions, I think you can expect a lot of innovation and a lot of strong solutions coming out, because the interest in those companies continues to remain. And I think the end result is going to be great solutions. I think if you're a vendor, like somebody that sells products, companies that we invest in, or a practitioner in the space, I think you've picked a good career. There is very little to suggest that the interest in this career is going in this area is going to slow down. In fact, so many of the speakers that preceded me today talked about so many new areas that we need to attack, so many new thoughtful extensions of what we're already doing. It really does seem like a permanent job employment for those of you that are practicing in the space. So it's a good way to think about the career that you've chosen.
That's great. Thanks, Paul. Well, I want to thank everybody on the panel and thank our listeners, and not only just for this session, but for being part of Identity Management Day 2022. Thank you to Julie for spearheading this and really putting a lot of effort behind getting all the right guests and people and organizing everything. So kudos to Julie. And I'd say takeaway for me is, given that there's at the speed at which we're going, that if you were doing identity management, if you think you're going to be doing identity management the same way you did it 5 years ago, you're in trouble. So you have to continue to keep abreast of all the different factors, not only technically, but as Paul mentioned, the market and how it's moving, and factor that into your investments and what you're doing and how you're choosing your vendors and how you're developing your strategy. So definitely, I think organizations like IDSA are really great for providing some of that information and bringing together experts to talk about identity and to write about identity. So hope you can continue to engage with IDSA, and of course all of us on the panel. Feel free to reach out. Let's continue the conversation. So thank you very much, and we'll see you soon, hopefully.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.